Kyle Maynard is the first man to bear crawl to the top of the highest mountain in Africa, Mount Kilimanjaro. He's also an entrepreneur, speaker, best-selling author, and award-winning extreme athlete. Born with a rare condition known as congenital amputation that left him with arms that end at the elbows and legs that end near the knees, Kyle has accomplished these incredible feats because of who he is, not despite his condition. Kyle invites no pity and compels us to totally reconsider the concept of disability. A few months ago, Kyle and I reflected on some of his personal challenges, getting in the metaphorical ring with Michael Jordan, and how he defines and navigates life's traumatic experiences. Let's drop into the conversation. Why don't you give people a little bit of your background, anything you want to share about who is Kyle Maynard?
Totally. So I was born a quadruple amputee. So basically my arms end at the elbows and my legs end at the knees, and grew up with parents that taught me that I could lead a normal life and do anything that I could set my mind to. Mm-hmm. So that was involved as a kid, just picking up and eating, learning to eat. Had to drop a spoon 1,000 times until I figured it out. And then it was like just wanted to be kind of a normal kid going to school and having a normal life until I was 11 years old and decided to have the dream to start playing in sports and football. And so basically I started playing football and wrestling at 11 years old. Was really, really bad at first and ended up becoming pretty successful. So by the time I was a senior in high school, I was I played football through middle school, and then focused on wrestling in high school. By the time I was a senior in high school, I was one of the top wrestlers in the state of Georgia, and was a match away from being an All-American at in high school. Then proceeded to have some media exposure from that. Had an opportunity to write my book. I did an interview on the book cover story on USA Today, an interview on Larry King that was like basically just set life on a totally different path. Then we had an opportunity to write a book, and then launched the book on Oprah at 19 years old. So at 19 years old, I became a New York Times bestselling author, and just started traveling the world as a public speaker and author. And it's basically, been kind of just a journey of exploration and, doing different things, going different places, meeting different people in all sorts of different ways. So more recently, I've been known for like mountain climbing, things like that, public speaking. And I've owned a CrossFit gym previously, and been involved in a few different startups and projects. I'm very close friends with a lot of special operators and special operations community as well. So very close to home with a lot of the work that you do. I've gotten to speak on a number of ton of different bases. Different groups. And for a while, I was pursuing the dream to become a Brazilian jiu-jitsu world champion. So I lived in San Diego for like 5 years, and became very close with the SEAL community. And so it was like, speaking to the different, the SEAL classes and stuff was pretty special. It's actually how, I think it was probably one of my first exposures to the, I think it was one of my very first exposures to like the inner workings of a special operations community. Mm-hmm. So it was, kind of being invited in, to be able to go and see things from the other side of the picture. It was fascinating.
I'm going to put a tag in that and kind of come back to that. Your athletic accomplishments aren't just wrestling. I mean, you've really gone after it in a number of different sports. I remember that you had won a strength of like a weightlifting competition as well. And you've done mixed martial arts and been really proficient in that. And then I read that you climbed Mount Kilimanjaro without the aid of prosthetics. And so, it's not just that you've gone after excellence in one sport, but really gotten after it with a number of different sports. Can you fill us in on, I mean, I'm really curious about, I think, the Mount Kilimanjaro without the aid of prosthetics. Can you give people a picture of what that was like and how you did that?
Sure. Yeah. So when I first started climbing, I basically started with bath towels and duct tapes like wrapped around the ends of my arms, and
Yep.
it was a brutal process at first. It was so the first ever thing that I climbed was a place. It was a stone mountain in Atlanta. It was
Hmm.
like a 900-foot climb. It was a CrossFit competition. I got invited to do the event like the night before, and had owned a CrossFit gym at the time, so we were had different ways to figure out how to go and do the different events. But the first event to compete in this 4-event competition, it was had to do a 1,000-meter row on a rowing machine, and then a
Hmm.
sprint up Stone Mountain. It was a sprint for everybody else that was in the group, and it was like it was a brutal bear crawl for me. So I got off
Hmm.
the rowing machine and I immediately threw on this vest that we came up with that was like a leather welding sleeve,
Hmm.
and
Okay.
it was kind of determined that the leather welding sleeve held up a lot better than my skin did. I
Hmm.
mean, the skin just tore up all
Of
the skin off the
course.
ends of my arms. It was
Yeah.
brutal. But I got to the top though, and I had a
Yeah.
different realization. And I was like, man, like this is just so much more beautiful having gotten here
Mm.
under my own steam, as
Mm.
opposed to like I'd been to the top of the place before, having taken the tram up to the top, and then you drop off and you can go and see a beautiful view of Atlanta. But when I
Yeah.
did it under my own steam, it had a totally different
You earned it.
perspective.
Earned the
Yeah. So it
ascent.
was like
Yeah.
exactly. So it was definitely that was my first exposure to climbing. It was my first, desire to kind of like get out and, explore the unknown and all that stuff. And it was like, yeah, kind of had the edge to go and do different things. So I put together a team to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. I actually had a friend that approached me,
Hmm.
um, and his name's Dan Adams. He just has been a part of like a number of other things along the way. He's like a record-setting middle linebacker. Like he's
Uh-huh.
just he was the first person that introduced me to like Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey and Carl Jung
Oh
and all
yeah.
that
Hmm.
stuff.
Cool.
And it was like, we just had this awesome connection. And, he sold me, the way he sold me on the Kilimanjaro climb was he played a song from the movie Inception. And it was a
Okay.
song called Time. And he was like, we had dinner and we were at this restaurant, and he just said, he was like, all right, just imagine we do this event and we, like put like, and it, like we make a video and it's to this song. And I was like,
Oh.
whoa, like I'm
Maybe
totally
like
in.
a mental movie of like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So it was the thing. So we called it Mission Kilimanjaro. We had the desire to
Mm.
impact veterans at the time. And it was, I believe at the time it was around 19 veterans per day that were committing suicide. And I think that number has gone up significantly since then. And, the goal was to try to like, create like a movement. Dan ended up kind of like carrying the thing further after we left. The big part of his mission is it's called like a be your own hero kind of thing.
Hmm.
And we kind of went in separate ways. And I pursued the public speaking after the Kilimanjaro climb. We had, ESPN filmed the whole thing. It was like a, big production, came down the mountain. And, then it was like immediately like life, just took on a totally different direction. It was like the busiest year of speaking that I've ever had. It
Mm.
was,
It was a
it
defining
was a
moment for you.
brutal schedule. Yeah, no, even like, so the year leading up to Kilimanjaro was like just the process to go and get
Hmm.
started on the climb. And then the year after Kilimanjaro was just like, public speaking and events and nonstop stuff. So it was like the wildest kind of like 2-year stretch.
Strap yourself onto a rocket kind of
Yeah,
life
totally. It
for a
was
couple
like,
of years.
very much like, yeah, literally, figuratively, and literally. I mean, I was like, I think my frequent flyer status at that point in time was like,
Hmm.
like diamond medallion, like times several other times over. Like
Platinum,
it was a
diamond,
lot. Platinum, diamond,
whatever.
triple, yeah,
One of
triple
the
diamond,
things that
platinum.
that we talked about in our pre-conversations was about this. I shared a memory of standing bedside with a warrior who had lost his arms in combat. And a lot of people, including people in my field, mental health providers, look at him with this sense of awe and compassion, perhaps, but also say, oh, that must be really traumatic for you to have lost your arms. And we had this moment of connection and understanding around that's not it. People aren't seeing you accurately if they think that's your trauma. That
Mm,
was not his trauma. And in fact, he told me that day bedside, uh, I was so proud of how I acquitted myself. I feel like I was tested and I responded the way a warrior responds on the battlefield.
mm.
And the loss of my arms is not my trauma. And so I thought about you. And one of the things I want to kind of drop into is what is trauma? And it may not be what we think it is for some people. What do you see trauma as, Kyle?
I think, okay, yeah. Then when you hit me with that too, when we talked about this earlier, it dawned on me that like trauma isn't always the most obvious. I mean, everyone has trauma to a degree,
Mhm.
but it's not always the most obvious thing as to what the trauma is necessarily, right?
Right.
That the like residual effect of the trauma that I have had, like as a child, potentially like the unresolved aspect of that, like, there was, I think that like, it's interesting. It's like this just deep desire to just be like a normal kid, right?
Mhm.
Was like, I just wanted to be a normal kid.
Mhm.
That was all that I ever kind of wanted. And I think that like I struggle with that still today, right? Because
Mhm.
especially like the nature of like, leadership and, leading groups of people through difficult events and all of that stuff, like it requires that you go above and beyond. It requires that you like take on
Mhm.
something that is like, more than yourself. I mean, if I didn't have this calling to go and impact the world on a certain level, I mean, a lot of ways I wish that I didn't. I wish that I
Yeah.
was like, I wish that I was just like, good with the world as it is. And I could just, go off. Okay, I think to give you, for instance, this is a totally random thing, but like my
Mhm.
friend invited me to this festival that's like, it's called Lightning in a Bottle.
Mhm.
And it's this like awesome festival that's going on this weekend. It's 5 days and it's like music, conversations, like amazing people. Like it's just, awesome time. And, I'm like a photographer, a videographer. That's one of my biggest like skill sets. It's not just as like speaking,
Okay.
like I make a
Okay.
lot of stuff and create a lot of stuff.
Cool.
If I had like put my effort into like pursuing that as opposed to like creating things that are going to go and like help the world, I would feel like I wouldn't be expressing myself as
Mm.
like fully as I possibly could.
Mm.
But I did realize after our conversation, I was like, that there's some like residual trauma effect from that, because like I had this like deep desire to just want to be a normal kid and lead a normal life.
Mhm.
And yet, circumstances and just my, ability to, I think, not just for me, but I think like, my friend group team that I'm surrounded by, all of that stuff. It's like all that evil needs to exist and to win in the world is for the indifference of good people. Right.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it creates this dynamic where it's like, I wish that I didn't care as much as I did
Sure.
or do. And
But to care
there's a
is
lot of other
human.
things that I would like to be doing in the event
Yeah.
that I wasn't, not doing the things that I'm doing currently. But then at the same time,
Yep.
I don't want to give that impression, because I'm also super excited about the things that I'm doing right now and the things that
Well, I
we're
guess.
creating and the things that we're like a part of. So I've got some amazing business partners, associates, like, friends that are helping shape this thing that
Yeah.
we're creating. And they've had beautiful visions for what this can go and be, and the offering that they're going to, that they've brought to this. Like it's this beautiful like melting pot of these ideas of what we're
Yeah.
creating. And I've shared with you briefly about what it is, but like currently I'm in a startup with three of my best friends, and that all are very different. Like they are like incredibly different, like people, and have this like
Mhm.
different drive and desire to like, impact the world in different perspectives. I mean, different views politically, different views, economically, different views, on a whole host of different issues. And I think that that's what the world needs right now, is that it needs like a wake up call in terms of the fact that like we can't have like myopic individual perspectives with things. We need to go in like, I see the word beyond, like that comes to mind, like the book behind you. It's like, we need to reach beyond. We need to go and reach beyond into a place that like has people, understand that like we are more than just, our disabilities. We're more than the color of our skin. We're more than like
Mhm.
our place of birth. We're more than our, faiths, like all of that stuff. And collectively, like, the totality of the beauty of that, like more than our political party or more than all of that stuff. Like it becomes this like,
Yeah. We do need that
Yeah,
expansion. You were in many ways born into a crucible of a kind. Your parents didn't teach you self pity, though. They didn't for a second. As you described to me, they taught you to live a full and meaningful life. And there's this interesting relationship between creativity and constraints.
mm,
Sometimes, I think we all have constraints. We all could have several life paths, right? And we can't do all of them. We have to choose
totally.
our paths. But sometimes I think the constraints that we face become the fuel for some of the amazing things we accomplish. And I think that principle certainly holds true with you. Can you talk a little bit about, what your definition of trauma is if you see this residual impact of kind of wanting to feel like everybody else being trauma? What does then trauma mean?
I think that, trauma, I think what comes to mind with that is like there's
Mhm.
like varying degrees and scales of trauma that like people have, right? I think
Right.
that like to put trauma into a category or bucket is the same way to put like disability into a category or bucket,
Okay.
right? Like,
Okay.
like one person's trauma and one person's disability, like they're just wildly different things, right?
Hmm.
Like we all have, my parents raised me with the mentality of like every single person on the planet, like has a disability, right? That it's like,
Interesting.
it's something that like, yeah, it's not unique to like any individual or anything, that like every single person, every one of us, like we have something that like, is a distinction, disability of sorts that like, it's going to be different for different people
Uh-huh.
based on different circumstances. And, it's yet, I think a huge aspect of it is like some people, have trauma based on like a physical type thing that they've experienced, right? Or some people have trauma based on like experiences that they've had that you would never be able to go and see on the outside.
Right.
Really brutal things, and
Yep.
terrible, difficult things, that like people like mask and cover. That it's easy to like,
Mhm.
to like put aside and to hide, and yet at the same time, like think of like somebody in like an abusive relationship, right?
Yeah.
Then I think it's like the cycle that of what that creates. It's,
Exactly.
it leads people to have like to a situation like until they're willing to like reconcile with what that thing is that's
Uh-huh.
keeping them in that trapped state of mind. Then they like effectively like they continue to become stuck inside of that circumstance, inside of that thing.
So I
Okay.
love that. I
It's
think
very different,
it's critical.
from something that's like a physical disability that you can go and see,
Uh-huh.
right? So somebody that's like an injured veteran, right? That you can go and see like the trauma that they've experienced in terms of like they're physically, like if they've lost their arms or they've lost their legs, right? Then that's a very different thing from somebody who's like potentially like, messed up on a mission or operation.
Yep.
They've made some terrible mistake and then they cost the lives of like their loved ones. And now they have to go and, spend the rest of their lives looking at like, the families of the kids, knowing that they could have done something different,
And a lot
and
of
that's a
those,
totally different type of trauma.
yeah, those traumas are invisible traumas. It's not the story we often hear about, oh, it was this one big event, right? Like a combat, like a firefight or something, and you had this feeling of helplessness or horror. It's these insidious, repeated, slow rolling traumas. You mentioned being in an abusive relationship being one, so to me, I think trauma is something that fundamentally changes our identity at some core level and changes how we feel about how safe we are in the world and how we navigate our relationships and our environment. And we all have it.
Mm,
We all have it, and it's not what we always see. And at the same time, there's this aspect of your story that I really want to bring to light, which is this concept you've been working on and developing that you're calling consensual adversity, which is, I think, a really important piece of the possibility of healing from trauma. Can you talk about that?
totally. Yeah. So this is a new concept that we're working on and developing. It's basically, the idea is, um, and I need a better way to go and like explain this, but it's kind of like, it's the Thai spiciness scale. You know, when you go and order Thai food,
Yeah. There's like
and you go and
peppers.
have like a one to 10 like spiciness level, right? So I've been looking for like a way after like I give a speech to go and impact people on like an ongoing deeper level, right? And different people are going to become, intrigued by different levels of like intensity with things. So I don't know if it's, my attitude is to try to go and like help as many people as possible based on like the circumstances that, that they have, right? And the desire. So it's, for instance, okay, so, but different people are drawn to different things, right? So it's, when I first brought my parents into my CrossFit gym and I was so excited about CrossFit, I was like, talking about it all the time. I was thinking about it all the time. I was obsessed with it. It was like, man, I found this new cool thing that like, I just want to like, do and be a part of. And I tried to get them to come in and do a workout at the CrossFit gym. They came in and I was writing a workout on the board, and I turned around for 5 seconds writing the workout on the board, and I turn around and my dad's like doing a bench press and my mom's doing like dumbbell curls. And I was like, it was like, okay, hold on. That's not what you guys are supposed to be doing. You need to come over here. You needed to do this workout. Right. And I was like, had that like mentality of, at the time I wanted to like, I was living, breathing, thinking about everything was CrossFit. Right. And I found a very similar thing with like jujitsu. When I got into jujitsu, I was like very like hyper evangelical about jujitsu. I was like, everybody needs to do jujitsu. Like jujitsu is like the only martial art, like, and like if you go and fight other people from other martial arts, like the jujitsu person would go and destroy the, person and all that stuff. Right? Like it was like this excitement that I'd had for jujitsu where it was,
I found the thing, that
I found the thing,
the ring that, kind of controls all the martial arts. That can, right.
So it's, it's one of those, like, I think that I've had that mentality and I'm trying to like temper my expectations with what we're currently creating. But the idea is to basically get people to a place where like of their own volition and their own like choosing that they can choose adversity over having adversity chosen for them. If you don't like choose, like if you don't, certain people, certain things, for instance, if you are several hundred pounds overweight, you're really struggling with things and you're on the verge of having, like a heart attack or stroke because of like, like you haven't been taking care of yourself, then it's like, a heart attack or stroke will be chosen for you.
Right.
So like, you don't have any choice in that at that point in time, right? Where you have a choice is the fact that like, it's, preventative kind of medicine, right? You can go and do something that then keeps the like heart attack or stroke from being chosen for you. You can go and do something. Now, different people are going to go and have different perspectives on things where it's like, I'm trying to think of like a different sort of example. Okay. This is as it relates to like, the United States and our debt ceiling.
Okay.
Right. At this present moment, we are approaching a situation where we are about to potentially enter a war on two fronts with $30 trillion of debt. And it's like mind blowing to me, the fact that like, then the conversation becomes like, is just not focused on like the most important things currently. Right. That's like, the conversation becomes focused on like a whole bunch of other stuff. That's like, okay, how come we're not really concerned about that? That could become like a crippling thing to our infrastructure. The conversation then becomes around things like, oh, am I going to get repayment for my student loans? Right. And it's like the attitude that JFK had of like, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, we've lost.
So this relates to pieces of conversation we've had about where people are with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The people that are under the survival threshold that worry about their physiological needs, their safety needs, that's going to divert all of their energy typically just to surviving, right? And then there's these different tiers of people. How does this concept of consensual adversity work with an example like how you've navigated disability?
Yeah. So it's like, with disability, it's fascinating. So that's an interesting point. Okay. So, when I was on the climbs at several points in time, I remember it was the fourth night of my climb on Kilimanjaro and the fourth night of my climb on Mount Aconcagua.
Mm-hmm.
I was basically like in my tent, like, hearing my friends laughing and joking outside and having fun while I was like in the tent, like suffering. And I felt like it was just not fair. It wasn't fair that like they were having fun and I wasn't. I was in a tremendous amount of pain. And both times I was at like a breaking point where I felt like I needed to quit, that it was no longer safe for me to continue to go on. And it was like, I got brought to that limit where I was like, it was very painful. It was brutal. It was like, and I hear my friends laughing and joking. And then I'm like, okay, I can't go on. I can't go any further.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, there became a difference of like, in both instances, I kind of reflected on like why I was there.
Okay.
And I got brought, to a point where I was like really contemplating, like, is this the right thing? Is it necessary? Like, like being that we're doing this climb for veterans. It was, I had made the promise to the mother of a fallen soldier named Corey Johnson. And she had actually given us her son's ashes to carry to the summit. And that was like that promise that I made to her that kept me going in that moment in time.
Wow.
And it was like
that transcended, that sacred transaction you had with his mother, Corey's mother, transcended all of that pain.
Yeah. And it resulted in like, it was like, okay, like I can't fail. I refused to. And it was so strange though, too. Like I'm just kind of cry thinking about it, because it was like something happened after that too. It was like the next day. So the fifth day we woke up and there was like some drama that ensued. One of our team members had gotten really sick and brought like a, wrong sleeping bag, had basically brought this like Walmart sleeping bag. It was like not, he got really sick.
It's freezing up there. Yeah.
Freezing. Yeah. And so then one of the Marines on our team gave him the sleeping bag, like, and like sacrificed himself. He had, this is a little TMI, but we'll go there for a second. He had like a bad case of diarrhea, like basically like, ruined the sleeping bags. Now we're like down 2 sleeping bags. And there's this, we didn't know what we were going to go and do. Like it was a mess. And so that was like the drama. There's people yelling at each other on the team, all of this stuff, like the craziness that was, happening, like leading up to that. And, I was just sitting there and I was, didn't tell everybody that I was like already like contemplating being in like the, pain to the extent that I didn't feel like I could continue on. And I was thinking about Corey the whole time.
Yep.
And, it was the fact that like, it's weird, like how big things evolve, like this idea of like, I choosing to be on that mountain. Like it hit me that like I had chose that, to be on that mountain, and Corey no longer being with us, like he didn't have an opportunity to choose anymore. Right. He didn't have that choice. The choice, due to circumstance and his sacrifice was taken. So I was like, okay, I'm choosing, I chose to be there in that climb, and I chose to, fight for like the impact that we could go and have on the veteran community. And after that, like I remember this, like on the 5th day after we got the things kind of squared away in terms of like the sleeping bag situation that unfolded, it turned into this, like we took off, we packed up our stuff and we started hiking. And it was a really long, hard day. And at that day, like something switched in my mindset and I became like 50% faster than I was the day before.
Wow.
And I was like, I had this intensity and this drive and desire where I like would not break my focus on the ground that was in front of me in this trail. And I just like kept going and going and going and going and fighting and fighting and fighting. And it was like, as I was going and pushing myself to that level, I was like, whoa, like I didn't know that I had this like depth of this reservoir that existed inside of me to be able to go and tap into.
That's what we do for each other when we truly connect. And it's like Corey gave you clarity on what you were fighting for. And that is one of the ways that, when we connect, we survive and we do things that we can't accomplish on our own steam.
Yep.
That is the hard to define, but present thing among people wired like warriors that do things that many people can't or won't do.
Yeah. And it's, I think that like that mentality is a unique, special one. And the difference people have that, happen and occur in different ways. Like if you think about like, an artist, an entrepreneur, like other people, like they have that, happen in different sorts of ways that like, but tapping into that, I think is really like a important kind of, it's an important concept, an important theme. It's kind of, like the attitude of like, you don't necessarily know what you're made of until you're faced in that situation or circumstance. And sometimes with like things like, like my sister, for instance, like her kids were born with type 1 diabetes. And so it's like, she spends a lot of like sleepless nights, waking up every night, like, may sleep 2 or 3 hours a night, waking up, sacrificing to go and take care of the kids. She works as a full-time job as a teacher. She has 2 other kids that don't have diabetes, but the diabetes is a 24/7 management thing. You don't get to like not have it. And it's also life-threatening. So literally they like, they could, if they don't manage it at any point in time, it could get out of range and it could literally be fatal.
So now that's an interesting thing right there, because it seems like that could be constructed as a kind of slow rolling trauma, that sort of pervasive sense of fear that something could happen. But I don't know if your sister would describe it that way. I mean, when you're in the place of a mother who would do whatever she needs to do for her kids, I don't know, how she would see that. To your point about trauma being different for everyone, depending on the situation.
Yeah, and it's something that's like a hidden kind of unseen thing in that way, right? Like it's something that like it's not obvious that that's like the like someone that like has that condition. You wouldn't we would unless you know somebody with diabetes. Then you don't like you don't fully understand what goes into that. It's the same way with being in a wheelchair, right? Like you don't really truly understand what it's like to be in a wheelchair until you're like until you're forced to be in that situation. And then you start to look for things differently. You start to look for like wheelchair ramps and stuff like that. Elevators become like a much more of an issue. You start to notice like how many places are inaccessible. It becomes like a different, like a completely different frame of reference, a completely different perspective, like something that like is like it's hard to like to deal with that. Like it's it's
filter life through a different set of perceptions, when that happens. How does consensual adversity apply to situations like having kiddos with potentially life-threatening diabetes, or navigating a wheelchair?
I think it's like I think it's still something when you consent to adversity, then anybody that goes to the gym and consistently works out is consenting to adversity. Right? Like it's when you sign up for the military on your own volition, you're consenting to adversity. If you're drafted, the adversity is chosen for you.
Right. You're accelerating into pain and you are consenting to a crucible that's going to shape your character.
Exactly. So the attitude of consent versus something that's like something that's chosen for you versus something that's like, that you choose for yourself, the relationship of that, I'm of the mind that like, if you can prepare yourself
Mm-hmm.
It's like an inoculation.
You can break the barriers of mental health. Given Hour's mission is to provide help and hope to those in need. As of 2021, Given Hour's volunteer network of mental health providers has delivered over 360,000 hours of barrier-free, no-cost mental health care. With a small gift of $5, you can give help and hope. Your generosity will allow Given Hour to deliver confidential mental health services and vital education tools. Thank you for your support, because mental health is just as important as our physical health. Visit www.givenhour.org to learn more or to donate. I want to circle back to what you said about the inner workings of special operators, because I think that comes in here. You were allowed to kind of come into their group and see behind the veil and think about how our special operators are wired. What did you observe that's relevant to our conversation?
The depth of care that they have for each other,
Mm-hmm.
I think, is like something that like most the average person doesn't understand if they haven't been there to see it.
Yeah.
But, it's
love.
one of the concepts.
It's love.
It's a different form of love than people would realize or fathom. The depth of it, I think, is fascinating. I think that it's like it's when like I think that the okay, so give it like I've had similar things with like being on like a wrestling team, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the team with the wrestling team, like we used to like, we'd have sleepovers. We would like hang out. We were like became this like bond, this family, right? Like it was, but there wasn't a life or death aspect to the, to the seriousness, the gravity of, of what they like go through. So it's like, if you lose a wrestling match, like it's a significant deal, but like, there's not like there's not a seriousness in that way that like the finality that exists in terms of like making mistakes inside of certain operations communities where it's like,
the stakes are high.
Mistakes are
very
high. I think about that all the time. So it's the other day, I was in my garage and I was, they're like the laser beam that like, that you trip to like open the garage or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes I'll play a game with it where I'm like, I don't remember how it was going down. Like sometimes, when I go and shut the garage and then try to like run out and like jump over the laser beam, right? Yeah, you beat it. Yeah, you just step over it and then it like, so it's, I did that in the garage and I missed the jump and I triggered the beam and I thought about that and I was like, if I were in like an operations environment and I made that mistake and I knew that what I did wrong, and then that would be like, that would have been game over.
Uh-huh.
And so it's like the level of like seriousness of that is something that like, the average person doesn't necessarily get to like be able to realize. So, the movie Hurt Locker kind of comes to mind where you have somebody that's like, at that level of like intensity, that level of being on. And then, they go to, potentially like, then they go back to like, the regular world. And that like juxtaposition of that stimulus and the intensity of, the world that they were in, then, coming back home is a very different thing.
When every cell in their body has been focused on, I will risk for you, I will suffer for you, I will have pain for you because you're my family, you're my tribe.
Right.
But you touched on that as a wrestler. I mean, you felt some of that bond. Were there times when, you were on the mat, wasn't going well, and you pulled from the strength of that bond to dig deep and do something? I mean, I'm sure. Can you remember any specific instance?
Oh yeah, for sure. I remember.
Share a story.
Yeah, like when I first started, for a year, the only move that I knew was how to wing a half Nelson. Mm-hmm. So that means I had to have somebody put me in a pinning combination and then put me on my back and basically like I had to like bridge just to stay off my back. So it was a year and a half before I won a match. Okay. And then when I finally, so it took a year and a half. So the whole time I was begging and pleading to quit, and my parents were like, didn't let me. And their rationale for it was they said that if they were going to pay the money for like me to be in like, that like, that season, then like I had to finish the whole season. And so it was, like a mentality where it was like,
that's not special. That's like a lot of parents. I'm going to tell you right now.
That's and very much, but it's one of those things where I was like, man, like, okay, like I'm literally getting my butt kicked in all of these matches. Like this is brutal. Like it was wild. It was insane. And so
makes me wonder though, Kyle, if you got inoculated to the fear of getting your butt kicked.
Probably
in a kind of strange way. You know what I mean? Like I think so many people fear losing, fear failing to do something they set out to do. When you think about a year of losing, essentially, before you started winning, it makes me wonder if in some weird way that might have helped inoculate you against what is a common barrier for a lot of people, athletes and otherwise.
Yeah, it's I think there's definitely something that's going on with that for sure. It was inoculative sports in a lot of ways, I think, provide that for people in different ways. I mean, there's a lot of athletes that like transition into, being successful. Wrestling in particular, there's a tremendous amount of wrestlers that end up as like Fortune 500 CEOs. It's a lot of people that like, that have that, like, they have that outcome in their life, because it's like, it teaches you to go and, it's not just the wrestling match. It's like the weight cuts, it's all kinds of stuff, like the, thirsty, hungry, just, having a hard time. Other sports like, that are really difficult sports, like, water polo and stuff like that. Like, like track and field sprinting, maybe like high level intensity lacrosse, things like that. They're actually like things that have like a combination of like massive endurance meets like, potentially like, it's just different.
It's interesting what you said about
the
wrestling.
Intensity.
I don't want to lose that.
The intensity, the intensity of the sport, though. That's where
there's an intimacy to it, though. That like close up, right? That's a difference. Like there's suffering, there's discipline in all of the elite sports, but when warriors talk about the intensity of hand-to-hand combat and what it feels like to be that close to someone, and be struggling when you're that close to someone to see who's going to dominate. That is a difference that might be a meaningful difference. What do you think?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's, there's nothing more intimate than having somebody that's literally like, that you're physically fighting against, right? That like, it's different than
not from a distance.
Yeah. But... No, like close quarters, like, it's a barbell, a barbell doesn't have emotion.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a sentient emotional thing. It's, a wrestler, a wrestling opponent that's, literally using everything in their power to control you and fight against you in that way. It's a totally different thing. If I were to play basketball with Michael Jordan, okay. Mm-hmm. Even Michael Jordan at 70 years old versus me in my athletic prime, there would be no competition. If I were to like wrestle against Michael Jordan, even in both of our athletic primes, I guarantee no matter what, I would give him a run for his money or probably beat him.
How much of it is mental? How much of it is sort of like psychological versus just the discipline of training with wrestling?
I think it's a bit of both. It's a war of attrition for sure. It's like, it's like, because you spend so much of your time hungry, thirsty, tired, like just in this drained kind of state that like, if you think about other groups, like, other like operators and things like that, I'm trying to think to like the SEALs, they sleep deprive people as part of like the training. A lot of other branches too, obviously, like the, if you're going to go through ranger training and stuff like that, then like, there's a massive aspect of like sleep deprivation. So, like sleep is a massive factor of recovery. When you go and take sleep away from somebody, then you can see, the inner workings of how somebody's going to go and deal with that adversity.
Yeah, it really strips you back to your bare essentials. So Michael Jordan comes into your ring.
Right.
Okay, your ring. What is your headspace?
In a wrestling match?
Yeah.
Well, that's my arena.
Yep. Right. Tell me more about that. Like, if your headspace could have a voice, like, what are you saying psychologically in that moment of when you just said, I would give him a run for his money?
Well,
probably.
Yeah, obviously, I said that in our athletic prime, he's one of the greatest athletes of all time. So I'm not going to go and underestimate the fact that, like, even if he hasn't ever wrestled before, he's still a phenomenal athlete. And there's, so he would probably be really hard to handle. Right.
Yeah.
Yet, in terms of basketball, like, no matter what, even him at 70 years old and me at my athletic prime, it's a totally different arena that I would never be able to keep up with him. So it's like, it's one of those things where that dynamic is, that with wrestling, it provided me an even playing field to be able to go and, like, compete with people on an even level. With, like, football, for instance, got to a point where, like, the guys I was competing against, I was 90 pounds, and the linemen I was competing against were 200 pounds. And there was no way, like, I was going to compete against a 200 person that was over double my size that had to, like, just bowl me over. Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, I think it's an aspect of, like, to reach a maximum, like, level of intensity, there has to become, like, a situation where there's an evenness of the playing field. There was a thing that my mom used to do when I was growing up, where, like, other kids would, they would sometimes, like, make fun of me and bully, and in kind of like a way, I would have my own way of handling it. Sometimes it was in jest, sometimes it was more hurtful, but kids would be like, I'm way taller than you. Right. And she would be like, well, sit down next to him.
Yeah.
When you sit down next to him and you go and see that, like, when you're sitting back to back, then, like, it's an even test. Right.
Yep.
So it's like, as a kid, then, like, that's the kind of thing where you're like, who's taller than who? Right. It's like, like the kid kind of, like, competition is a totally different thing than, like, the way that we want to compete as adults, but, like, there's hierarchy and competition at every sort of level along the way. Right. So it's, that aspect of things is, like, that sit down test was something that, like, it made me feel really good as a kid, because, I was like, my mom was sticking up for me, and, like, would make other people go and sit down, next to me. That was like, now it's an even test. If somebody that's, maybe say somebody that's, like, I think I'd probably be around 6 foot, 6'1", maybe something, like, I don't know, maybe around that. I've had this, what the projection was, so that her doctor said, maybe, so say I'm 6'5", my dad's 5'10", 5'11". Yeah. So when my dad goes and sits down next to me, I'm a solid 2 inches taller than my dad.
Yeah.
So it's like, when when we're back to back, then I'm not towering over him, but I'm taller than he is. Right. Than my trunk and torso.
Average size, actually. Yeah. Right.
So it's like, we have, like, obviously if he's standing over top of me, then it's going to be, like, a totally different thing.
That's not the test of it. Right. So, your sort of natural height is average to tallish, somewhere in that range. But to go back for a second to Michael Jordan, because that's a fascinating thought analysis that is really intriguing to me. I think you're really onto something there. So it isn't really a level playing field, because he comes into your arena. It's an arena where you've been tested, and the contours of that pain, and your body knows, like, at a muscle memory way, how you can kind of rotate, angle, use technique that he's not going to know.
Right.
He's going to be foreign to him. So I think that's really interesting, that there is this psychological and physical edge that you can earn in something where you just know, this is my arena.
Yeah. And it's like, I think that, like, an attitude of, of owning that, and I think being respectful. I think what comes up for me there too is, like, being respectful of what translates to, in a world where everyone has political opinions about everything,
Yeah.
then like it's giving credit where credit's due to like the people that have like specialized in certain areas and certain things. I may have perspectives on adversity given like the, like the life that I've lived, but you actually have like background and credentials in this stuff, right? You actually have like learned the, the actual like technical aspect of things. Not saying that there's aren't not, other therapists that aren't like better analysts than you, right? I don't know. We've just met, I know other analysts that like, might be, like that arena. That's when it becomes interesting. Then it becomes a comparison of like, you know, like you think about like basketball in that analogy, Michael Jordan, like there was, at that point in time, I'm forgetting like who the, like, like the big, like, it was after Larry Bird and before LeBron James, right? Like they were kind of the Bulls were like the dominant sort of like force there. But, if you think about even back with Larry Bird, for instance, like, the Lakers and the Celtics were like this opposing force against each other that had like, that brought out like the betterment, of the group, like the, you sort of like, there's other, like analysts that like, and other therapists that compete for people's attention in terms of like podcasts and things like that, right? That like, it drives you to become better in a lot of ways. So the competition aspect of things very much drives us. And as I said, so I think it's like, certain adversities can be chosen for us, or we can choose them ourselves. Michael Jordan chose the path of becoming a basketball player. I chose the path of becoming a wrestler and a jiu-jitsu guy. So, that's why in the realm of wrestling and jiu-jitsu, even though he's like a fully able-bodied guy and it's larger than I am, and like, I still would feel confident in my ability to like, to be able to take him out. In basketball, there's no chance. I stand, zero. There's nothing for him to gain there. There's nothing for, there's nothing, that would be interesting about that. He could literally just hold the ball above my head, dribble it every now and then, walk around me and dunk, like there's nothing I could do to stop him. So, but then
I watched a documentary about Michael Jordan one time, and who knows if this is true. It's what the documentary presented, so I'm not taking this as the truth, but it seemed to present that he was fueled by this intense desire to show people, coming from being told that he couldn't,
totally,
or cut from a team, or basically told, stay kind of, you're not going to really be a standout, work hard, but you're never really going to make it. And that was like the piece of sand that was like in his shell, or however the analogy is, the burr under his saddle that like was the goad to him that pushed him.
I think he was actually, he didn't make his high school basketball team. I think he was actually like,
he was cut or benched or had some like wounds of that kind that burned him with shame and said, I'm going to show that you're wrong about me, about who I am. I wonder, as somebody who has accomplished a lot in different elite sports, do you think competition has to be fueled by that, or do you think it's fueled by different things? Because Wayne Gretzky felt very different to me in other kind of profiles I've seen of him in terms of, what fueled his greatness.
I think, so Wayne Gretzky, one of my favorite quotes from him is he said, don't skate to where the puck is at, but skate to where it's going.
Mm-hmm. Going to be
where it's going to be. And it's like his team playing of like the degree of like assist and all of that, like is, like that mentality that he had of like being a team player, of, being in that environment. I think that like in, the intelligence. So Wayne Gretzky in my mind was not like he wasn't the best athlete, but it was his like strategy.
He would say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. He would say that. I've seen him quoted saying, there's people that could outskate me, but what he did was just this relentless repetition of strategy, watching game after game after game and figuring out where is the puck? How do I get there? And then protecting himself, from getting injured and finding that sweet spot where he could always, kind of like make this shot that nobody else could.
No, he had a really long career too. I mean, if you think about like, I got a chance to meet Cal Ripken, another person that comes to mind with like, he had like, the Iron Man, right? Like he had like a super long like career. And like, you think about like somebody that has that mentality of taking care of himself over a long period of time, then it becomes like a totally different kind of dynamic. It's, and a different level of thinking that goes into like the the risk analysis of all that stuff that like, somebody has when they are like, going through that. Like there's mountain climbing guides that I know that are like, reckless and just take enormous risk with things. There's others that are more conservative. And then there's some that are going to be kind of like in between, right? Like it's, but one of my favorite quotes by Jordan Peterson, he says that you only get to play certain games when you go to like, certain like, links, is something like that. You only get to play certain games if you commit to certain like things or criteria, something along those lines. And it's kind of a fascinating concept. It's like, you only get to become like a professional athlete if like you commit to competing at things at a professional level, right? Like you only get to, to go and soar to certain heights if you're willing to like let go of the shore kind of thing, right? Like there's an attitude and a perspective of like risk associated with certain things that like,
definitely,
it's only when you'll only go there when you have the freedom to like commit at certain levels or certain degrees, which tying it back to like the whole consensual adversity and, the Thai spiciness scale. It's like, there's a 1 to 10 experience in terms of like, if somebody that's like deconditioned and they're just looking to go on a, walk and like walk around the block kind of thing and like just get back into like a level of fitness that's like a 1 or a 2 kind of intensity level, right? If somebody commits to like, working out at a CrossFit gym locally, that might be at like a 4 or 5 kind of thing, right? It's more intense, but then it kind of ramps up from there, right? Somebody goes and like enlists to go to boot camp in the Marine Corps, and like, that we're talking like that's a much more intense, like a 7 or 8 kind of thing. Somebody that gets a contract to go to BUDS as a SEAL operator or, Ranger school, something like that, then it's like, now we're talking like a 9 or a 10. At a 9 or a 10, then it's like, you don't even necessarily know if you have the physical capacity to be able to do it. At like, it becomes like a totally different thing, a totally different dynamic. So
you consent to the crucible and the rest of it is to be determined.
yeah. And it's like, I think that attitude of like, when you consent to that thing, when, somebody like politician, for instance, too, goes through the same thing, right? When you go and consent to like a political environment, then you consent to having your life torn apart in every conceivable way, right? So it's like, it becomes fascinating. I had a realization. It was actually on a psychedelic. I realized that like at a certain level and a certain degree, companies like Google, Apple, Facebook, and the amount of data that they go and collect on people could effectively just go and blackmail everyone. And so it became very clear to me that like one of the ways around that would be to like just be as confusing and as non-inoculative as possible in terms of like, when people like when you zag, and like not necessarily let people know what you're thinking or who you are, what you're about or all of those things, like have it be shown through your character and your actions of what you actually produce in the world. It's not so much like the things in which we say, but we are collectively who we are is much more about like the things that we do, right? Emerson said, like, your word speaks, your action speaks so loudly, I can hardly hear what you say.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground today, and it's been so much fun for me to have this conversation with you. So some of the things about trauma that we've uncovered are that it's not always what people expect, that sometimes trauma is truly those invisible things like being in an abusive relationship that takes a toll, that it depends on the person and the context, and that giving consent to the adversity in our lives can be a game-changing approach to looking at how we can heal and empower ourselves. I want to give you the last word, and maybe about trauma or overcoming adversity. What would you want to share as we kind of wrap this up? And then I want you to stay on for a few minutes at the end just to make sure the recording downloads and all that stuff.
Yeah. So let's see if I can say this without crying. It was, so after I mentioned Jordan Peterson, and after I heard him speak in San Diego, I stood outside for like an hour and a half and I waited to meet him. I chased him down and I found out he was like going through like a back door and kind of intercepted him. I shook his hand and we just had a brief interaction. There was another guy that was trying to get his attention. And he said something to me that struck me And I think something that I'll leave you with and leave your audience with. I told him when I shook his hand and he looked me in the eye, I just said, thank you for everything that you've done for me. And he said, keep going, buddy. And to anyone who's listening to this, that's in a rough spot, I say that to you. Keep going, buddy.